Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to do a fool's errand. I'm going to try to predict future classic books. This is sort of a response to the New York Times list of the 100 best books of the 21st century so far. I will link my reaction video to that list and to the reader's list that accompanied it in the description box down below if you would like to check those out. Really, those lists just got, the old hamster wheel spinning about what books are likely to be future classics, because I think some of the books that they included from recent years, I wasn't as convinced would be classics in the future, or would be anything that we would really be talking about in the future. And in talking to other people in the comment section on both of those videos, a lot of people kind of echoed that sentiment, saying, I don't know that this is still something we'll be talking about in a couple of years. It seems like it's just popular now. So I started thinking, what are books that have come out recently that will still be classics in the future? Something we will still be talking about in 20 years, potentially 50 years, and things like that. It's actually something that Jackie McMenamin, a commenter, had sort of gotten into my head earlier in the year. And I decided I was going to shorten the time period. I was kind of originally thinking about the first 25 years of the 21st century. And I feel like where it really gets difficult is in the last 10 to 15 years. So I'm not really going to be talking about books from 2000 through 2009. And I'm going to try to limit a little bit of 2010 through 14. I'm really trying to make this even more difficult for myself by thinking about what are recent books that could make it. And it's really came into play a lot more with the reader's list, because the reader's list has a bit more of a recency bias. More recent books appear on that list than do the more formal New York Times list. And I just thought it would be a really interesting topic. So here we are. The reason it's so difficult to tell what books are going to make it and become classics is that books can be wildly popular when they're first published and then fade away with time. And books that were overlooked when they were published can gain audiences and appreciation over time. The Great Gatsby was a commercial and critical disappointment when it was first released in 1925. It was only when it was published as a cheap paperback for soldiers during World War II that it became wildly popular. And when those soldiers came back to the United States, they began reading more F. Scott Fitzgerald, and suddenly The Great Gatsby became something that was taught in schools. And fast forward 100 years later, it is considered one of the biggest American classics of all time. And no one, 1925 through 1930, would have ever predicted that it would be in that league. And consequently, as I said, some books that are really popular tend to fade over time. I think if you flashed back to 2010 and had a discussion about some of the best recent books, I really feel like The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri is something that a lot of people would talk about. And yet, all this time later, 2024, it didn't appear on the New York Times list and it didn't appear on the reader's list. So you can see that something that is wildly popular in one moment can sort of fade away over time. And that's what makes it really difficult. So without further ado, let's just dive in. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about each of the books. These are going to reflect a bit of a bias from me. I tend not to read a whole lot of translated literature. I do read a fair amount of translated literature, but it is difficult for me to judge adequately. Like, one of the books I've enjoyed the most in recent years was Mammoth by Eva Baltasar, translated by Julia Sanchez. I don't think it's going to be a future classic. So it feels like it's sort of stuck in a world there. So this is going to be a very Western, or like, when I say Western, I mean like North America or English-speaking Europe-centric list. It just kind of is. And maybe over time, as I read more translated literature, I'll have a bit more of a foundation for that. But, as the New York Times list and the reader's list also had those biases, I feel a little bit okay with that, because I'm sort of responding on the same playing field that they were at, if that makes sense. But the first book I want to talk about is one of the ones that I feel is the most obvious future classics. Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. This was included on the New York Times list, the official one, and it was #1 on the readers list. And the fact that it made it on the readers list and the New York Times list is one harbinger, I think, that it is destined to be a future classic. I think the enormous popularity of Demon Copperhead is probably enough to help it earn classic status, but it also has a really mean pedigree. It tied for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, it won a Women's Prize, and if that's not enough, I do think Demon Copperhead's connection to Charles Dickens and David Copperfield, the book that inspired this, that will help seal the deal. It has a connection to another classic that is already beloved. It is really beloved by readers. It's really beloved by critics. It's beloved by book prizes. It has a mean pedigree. I feel like this is destined. And although it is a very recent book, it was published in 2023, I feel very confident that this is a book that people will still be talking about in 50 years, in 100 years. Do I know that for sure? No. But I feel pretty safe assuming that this is destined to be a classic. There was one book that had been published this year in 2024 on the readers list. It was not included in the New York Times list, but I really think that's just because of the timing that it was released this year. And as I said, the Times list had a bit less of a recency bias. But I feel pretty confident that in this instance, the readers list got it correct. This is James by Percival Everett. You could pretty easily make a case for a different novel by Percival Everett when considering future classics, and that would be his Booker shortlisted novel, The Trees. In some ways, there's a stronger argument for that book since we have a track record for The Trees displaying pop culture staying power. It's been a couple of years and people still point to it when you talk about great books from recent years. However, I also think The Trees is a bit more divisive than James. I think Percival Everett is an author who is destined to be a classic author in the future, and James is probably the book of his that is most likely to get him there. It feels like more of a consensus choice, something that a majority of people can get behind. Is a lot of that to do with the fact that James is a spin on an American literary classic? Yes, in much the same way that Demon Copperhead feels like a lock because it is a spin off of a beloved British classic. Does it also feel less prickly than The Trees? In other words, is James less likely to alienate white readers who are uncomfortable with heavy discussions of race? Also, yes. And is it a shame that we need to consider the comfort level of white readers? Also a resounding yes. But I think Percival Everett is an author who is destined to be talked about in 50 years, in 100 years. And James really does feel like the book that is the most likely one to get him there. Although he is still writing, so it's always a possibility that one of his future books will be the one to get him there. But I just feel like that seems like a safe bet, even though we haven't even really seen the full arc of what it will achieve in the year that it was published. Now let's talk about The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. This was the most popular book the year that it was published. It won a Pulitzer. It won a National Book Award. It does not feel like enthusiasm for The Underground Railroad has lost an inch of momentum. Perhaps it will in time. As I said, it feels like in the first few years after The Namesake was published, it felt like it was a lock. But The Namesake doesn't have the pedigree that The Underground Railroad does. So I feel like it has a pretty good shot at becoming a classic. Then we have Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. I nearly put this in a bit of a different category, something that would feel likely, but not so much of a sure bet, simply because Hamnet was a surprise absence on the New York Times list. I started getting all in my head about that, thinking, does that indicate that support for this beautiful novel is waning? Ultimately, it could mean that. But as I reflect on it, I think there's still a lot of love for this book. It made it up to 22 on the readers list for one thing, but I also think that Hamnet is going to continue to be relevant as part of Shakespeare scholarship, if nothing else. And there is a movie adaptation coming. One thing I have learned is that a successful film adaptation can really help a book's reputation endure. I'll bring up The Namesake again. It had a film adaptation, but the film adaptation was somewhat mixed in terms of reception. Didn't make a huge splash at the box office. So if the film adaptation of Hamnet lands more heavily than that, we could be looking at something in the realm of To Kill a Mockingbird or, Gone with the Wind. Movies and books that have sort of helped each other remain popular over time. So there's still a bit of a question mark, but I feel like Hamnet remains a bit of a safe bet. Now let's talk about one that I don't own a copy of, Milkman by Anna Burns. I was all set to call this an absolute sure shot as a future classic, and then I got in my head, very similar to the way I got in my head about Hamnet, because Milkman failed to make both the Times list of the best 100 books of the 21st century so far and the readers list. That felt really shocking to me because when I initially asked people who follow this channel which books from the last decade could be future classics, Milkman was the most common answer to that question. Personally, I still think it will get there, but the fact that it missed both lists gives me just a bit of a pause. I do think that it seems like it's more likely that it was a bit of a fluke that it didn't make both of the lists. But, ultimately only time will tell. We'll have to wait and see. Now let's talk about Salvage the Bones by Jesmyn Ward. There's a good chance that Jesmyn Ward will be most remembered for Sing Unburied Sing, but when discussing Jesmyn Ward's work with other readers recently, it appears that Salvage the Bones is the one that people remember most fondly, including from myself. Of course, it's possible that Ward also has more future classics in store for us, kind of like what I said about Percival Everett. Like, she's not done writing. Her biggest future classic, or her book with the most potential to be a future classic, could be something that's coming. But I think the fact that people keep pointing back to Salvage the Bones and Sing Unburied Sing, despite the very difficult topics that they cover, really says that there's a lot of enthusiasm for her and her work and for these works in particular. And I do think Salvage the Bones has a very good chance of being a future classic. Now, let's talk about another book I don't own, which is Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. I mostly included Song of Achilles because of reader enthusiasm, but if you don't find that to be convincing, consider that Song of Achilles also won a Women's Prize for fiction back when it was still known as the Orange Prize. I was more muted on it than a lot of other people, which has also made me hold off on reading Circe by Madeline Miller, which is another book that could potentially be a future classic. However, it is a book that I constantly hear people absolutely rave over. I've heard many people refer to Song of Achilles as their favorite book of all time, and for that reason, I feel like I have to include it on this list. It feels like it could absolutely be a future classic. And then another book I don't have. I keep going to grab something off of my pile and then realizing I don't have it there. Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. Saunders was one of 3 authors who made the Times list 3 times, the most of any other author, and 3 people achieved that feat. That really did feel like a lot. It felt surprising that he had made the list that many times, but then he nearly repeated the feat by making it to the readers list twice. That probably indicates that he has the critical and popular success to endure. The question is, for which book? Saunders is mostly a writer of short stories, so maybe 10th of December, but his lone novel so far, Lincoln in the Bardo, won a Booker Prize and outranked Saunders' other books on both lists. To me, that means that enthusiasm is probably on the side of Lincoln in the Bardo. And even when the New York Times Book Review did a podcast interview with him about the list, they completely ignored his other 2 books that had made the list, Pastoralia and The 10th of December, to discuss Lincoln in the Bardo for the entire duration of the podcast. Like, 10th of December barely came up, and they didn't mention Pastoralia at all, which seems to indicate Lincoln and the Bardo is the one that could really get him there. Those are the books that I think have the best chances at being future classics. Let's talk about some books that are a little, they still seem like they could be likely, but they have maybe, let's call them outside chances of being future classics. The first one we should talk about here is They're There by Tommy Orange. I had been feeling in the years since it was published that sentiment on They're There was mellowing too much for it to attain classic status. But then The Wandering Stars, a sort of sequel, sort of prequel, was published and made it onto the long list for the Booker Prize. Now, there's a chance that that means that Wandering Stars is the future classic, but since that book doesn't feel like it has made a James-level splash, I'm going to assume that the predecessor is the one that will stand out, especially since those two books are so inherently tied that They're There almost by necessity is part of any conversation about Wandering Stars. There just really isn't enough information at this point to indicate otherwise. But I think there's a good chance They're There will become a future classic. We just don't really know for sure. We don't know for sure with any of these, but it feels like a bit more of a reach than the other ones I've talked about so far. And then there's Tin Man by Sarah Winman. It feels like in order to be a classic, you need consensus from audiences and literati, like people who work within the publishing industry or book critics or things like that, because it keeps the conversation going. Audiences seem to love Tin Man. I had gotten recommendations to read Tin Man for years at this point, and I finally got around to reading it this year, and I absolutely loved it. It's my favorite read of the year so far. But I hadn't really seen much of anything about it when it was published. I haven't seen it popping up on critics lists. I haven't really heard much about it in the publishing world. It's a great book, though, and I think it is one that could be timeless. This would be a situation where reader enthusiasm would have to propel it into being a classic. And I would love to see that because I think it's a beautiful, beautiful book. Then there's Matrix by Lauren Groff. Now, unlike Tin Man, Matrix does have adoration from audiences and industry people like critics, but somehow it still feels a bit low profile. I think earlier books like Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff are too divisive. So I think Lauren Groff is an author we will still be talking about in the future. But maybe this is a case where her future classic is still to come. I love Matrix. I would love it if people were still talking about a book about a girl boss lesbian nun 100 years into the future. But we'll see. There's a bit of a question mark about whether or not it will be this book or if it will be Lauren Groff's coming bookstore. She's opening one. I think it will be next year, 2025. Or if it will be a future book of hers that will get her in future conversations with readers. Now, here's a book that I'm just really not convinced about, and maybe that's a bias on my part because I'm not as much of a fan of the book. It's Trust by Hernan Diaz, the book that tied Demon Copperhead for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction the year that they were both eligible for the prize. I will link my reaction video to that win down below because I almost freaked out I did freak out when there was a tie. A lot of people will probably disagree with me on this, but I think Trust is a book that will fade away over time. Part of what makes it feel so urgent or relevant when it was published was that the economic angle felt timely when read at a time when corporations and money markets were taking advantage of a pandemic to drive prices up. But the fact that Trust is set around the Great Depression and resonates with anyone who lived through the economic downturn of 2008 and the pandemic could show that it ultimately will be timeless, because clearly these are issues with money and the economy that keep circling back and becoming relevant all over again. We'll just have to wait and see what happens with Trust. It did outrank Demon Copperhead on the New York Times list, but then Demon Copperhead far outranked it in the readers list. So we'll see what happens in the future. Northwoods by Daniel Mason. Again, maybe I'm a bit biased because I wasn't such a fan of this book compared to other readers, but I think a lot of people are excited about Northwoods right now. And I think in a couple of years, people won't be talking about it anywhere near as much as they are right now. But maybe I'm wrong. Only time will tell. Now let's talk about All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. Here's the thing. A great deal of reader enthusiasm exists for this book, and it has street cred. It won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction, but it's the reader enthusiasm that makes me wonder if this could be a future classic. When the Times list of the 100 best books of the 21st century was released, one of the omissions most frequently commented on and passionately argued for in the comment section on my video about that was All the Light We Cannot See. That energy propelled it to a second place finish on the readers list that came after the Times list. But enthusiasm can wane over time. Again, I'll mention The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri. It's hard to tell if reader enthusiasm for All the Light We Cannot See will continue or if it will suffer a similar fate. And that is why I am including it in this place where it seems like it could be likely, but it feels a little less certain. And the last book I'll talk about in this section is A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. The case here is very much the same as it was for All the Light We Cannot See, except the reader enthusiasm only took A Little Life to 11th place on the readers list. Since A Little Life is so divisive among readers, and for the record, I am among those who did not like it at all, it has a tough road to achieve the overall good regard needed to become a classic, but the people who love A Little Life will fight for it until the end of time. I've heard many people talk about how this is their favorite book of all time. And again, I am the opposite end of the spectrum from that. And that's the divide that most people find themselves on with A Little Life. But there's no denying that a lot of people are extremely passionate about A Little Life. The final category of book that I want to talk about in this video are just books that I would love to see become classics in the future. And the first one is The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Honoré Fanonne Jeffers. I love this book. It is a hefty book. Like, you could really hurt someone with this book if you wanted to. I don't know why you would want to, but you could. It's just a wonderful book. It flows effortlessly. Like, I actually wanted to spend more time in this world and with these characters because it is so good. It is so good. I'll link my video with my favorites from last year because that is when I finished this book, and I talk about it in there because it was my favorite book that I read last year. It's so good. I think it should have won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction the year it was released, and it's still a crime to me that it wasn't even a finalist for that. It is that good. And I would love to see people continuing to talk about this book in 50 years, in 100 years, in 500 years, you name it. Then there's The Good Lord Bird by James McBride. James McBride is another author that I feel like is someone who will still be in the conversation in 50 years. And it's interesting because different people respond to different books of his. I love The Good Lord Bird, which was the first one of his that I read. I have spoken to many people who love The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store, which is hanging out here in the spot that The Good Lord Bird is usually faced out on my shelf. There are also people who love Deacon King Kong and his nonfiction book, The Color of Water. So there are a lot of roads to being a future classic for James McBride. Since this one is my favorite, it's the one that I would root for, but, you know, maybe his next book will be the one that will help him achieve future classic status. Then there's Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi. This came out the same year as Underground Railroad, and I confess, I read this first. And I felt a little bitter that whole year because a lot of the things that people were talking about and saying about Underground Railroad, I had already gotten from Homegoing. And I wished that people had paid more attention to this book. So it's been very gratifying to me over the years that it feels like there has been a bit of a resurgence in like a word of mouth spread about Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi, where people who didn't know about it the year it was published because all of the attention was going to the Underground Railroad have discovered it and loved it. And that has been really good for me to see. And I would love for this to be a book that people continue to talk about well into the future. I have two more. You knew this one was coming. It's My Beloved, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. This is something that I have really enjoyed helping introduce people to through my channel because I talk about it a fair amount. It's my beloved. And even people who are not big on short story collections have really loved this book. And I've had so many people tell me that they read this book and just absolutely loved it. And I have been so happy about that. And I would love for this to be a short story collection that people continue to talk about far down the road. And The Secret Lives of Church Ladies is more of a traditional short story. Night of the Living Rez is a linked story collection, and it's another one that I have felt very gratified to see so many people reading and discovering, although it feels like more people have found this than have found My Beloved, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. And that's great. I'm really happy that people have found their way to Night of the Living Rez and that they have read Morgan Talty's more recent novel, Fire Exit, because Night of the Living Rez is powerful and I think it deserves every good thing that it has coming. So those are some books that I think are destined to be future classics, some books that I have a bit of a question mark about, and some books that I would like to see become future classics. I would love to hear if you disagree, if you have recommendations for translated works in literature. And again, I love Mammoth by Eva Baltazar, but I don't know that it could become a classic. So let me know what you think would be a great translated work that could become a classic. Let me know if you agree or disagree with anything that I've said in this list. Let me know all of that in the comment section down below. And as always, I really appreciate your time. I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.